I'm reading from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, paragraph 625. Just as the decision to become man apparently makes use of the ancient Egyptian model, so we can expect the process itself will follow certain prefigurations. The approach of Sophia betokens a new creation, but this time it is not the world that is to be changed. Rather, it is God who intends to change his own nature. Mankind is not, as before, to be destroyed, but saved. In this decision, we can discern the philanthropic influence of Sophia. No new human beings are to be created, but only one, the God-man. For this purpose, a contrary procedure must be employed. The second Adam shall not, like the first, proceed directly from the hand of the Creator. The second Adam shall not, like the first, proceed directly from the hand of the Creator, but shall be born of a human woman. So this time priority falls to the second Eve, not only in a temporal sense, but in a material sense as well. On the basis of the so-called proto-evangelium, the second Eve corresponds to the woman and her seed, mentioned in Genesis 3:15, which shall bruise the serpent's head. And just as Adam was believed to be originally hermaphroditic, so the woman and her seed are thought to be a human pair, as the Queen of Heaven and Mother of God, and as the divine Son who has no human father. Thus Mary, the Virgin, is chosen as the pure vessel for the coming birth of God. Her independence of the male is emphasized by her virginity as the sine qua non of the process. She is a daughter of God who, as a later dogma will establish, is established at the outset by the privilege of an immaculate conception and is thus free from the taint of original sin. It is therefore evident that she belongs to the state before the fall. This posits a new beginning. The divine immaculateness of her status makes it immediately clear that she not only bears the image of God in undiminished purity, but as the bride of God is also the incarnation of her prototype, namely Sophia. Her love of mankind, widely emphasized in the ancient writings, suggests that in this newest creation of his, Yahweh has allowed himself to be extensively influenced by Sophia. For Mary, the blessed among women, is a friend and intercessor for sinners who all men are. Like Sophia, she is a mediatrix who leads the way to God and assures man of immortality. Her assumption is therefore the prototype of man's bodily resurrection. As the bride of God and Queen of Heaven, she holds the place of the Old Testament Sophia. Paragraph 626. Remarkable indeed are the unusual precautions which surround the making of Mary. Immaculate conception, extirpation of the taint of sin, everlasting virginity. The Mother of God is obviously being protected against Satan's tricks. From this we can conclude that Yahweh has consulted his own omniscience, for in his omniscience there is a clear knowledge of the perverse intentions which lurk in the dark Son of God. Mary must at all costs be protected from these corrupting influences. The inevitable consequence of all these elaborate protective measures is something that has not been sufficiently taken into account in the dogmatic evaluation of the Incarnation. Her freedom from original sin sets Mary apart from mankind in general, whose common characteristic is original sin and therefore the need of redemption. The status ante lapsum is tantamount to a paradisal, i.e. pleromatic, and divine existence. By having these special measures applied to her, Mary is elevated to the status of a goddess and consequently loses something of her humanity. She will not conceive her child in sin like all other mothers, and therefore he also will never be a human being, but a god. To my knowledge, at least, no one has ever perceived that this queers the pitch for a genuine incarnation of God, or rather that the incarnation was only partially consummated. Both mother and son are not real human beings at all, but gods. Paragraph 627. The arrangement, though it had the effect of exalting Mary's personality in the masculine sense by bringing it closer to the perfection of Christ, was at the same time injurious to the feminine principle of imperfection or completeness, since this was reduced by the perfectionizing tendency to the little bit of imperfection that still distinguishes Mary from Christ. Thus, the more the feminine ideal is bent in the direction of the masculine, the more the woman loses her power to consummate the masculine striving for perfection, and a typically masculine ideal state arises, which, as we shall see, is threatened by an Enantiodromia. No path leads beyond perfection into the future. There is only a turning back, a collapse of the ideal, which could easily have been avoided by paying attention to the feminine ideal of completeness. Yahweh's perfectionism is carried over from the Old Testament into the New, and despite all the recognition and glorification of the feminine principle, this never prevailed against the patriarchal supremacy. We have not, therefore, by any means heard the last of it. Paragraph 628. The older son of the first parents was corrupted by Satan, and not much of a success. He was an eidolon of Satan, and only the younger son, Abel, was pleasing to God. In Cain, the God image was distorted, but in Abel it was considerably less dimmed. If Adam is thought of as a copy of God, then God's successful son, who served as a model for Abel, and about whom, as we have seen, there are no available documents, is the prefiguration of the God-man. Of the latter, we know positively that, as the Logos, he is pre-existent and co-eternal with God, indeed as the same substance as he. One can therefore regard Abel as the imperfect prototype of God's Son, who is about to be begotten in Mary. Just as Yahweh originally undertook to create a chthonic equivalent of himself in the first man, Adam, so now he intends something similar, but much better. The extraordinary precautionary measures above mentioned are designed to serve this purpose. The new Son, Christ, shall on the one hand be a chthonic man like Adam, mortal and capable of suffering. But on the other hand, he shall not be, like Adam, a mere copy, but God himself, begotten by himself as the Father, and rejuvenating the Father as the Son. As God, he has always been God, and as the Son of Mary, who is plainly a copy of Sophia, he is the Logos, synonymous with nous, who, like Sophia, is a master workman, as stated by the Gospel according to St. John. This identity of mother and son is borne out over and over again in the myths. Paragraph 629. Although the birth of Christ is an event that occurred but once in history, it has always existed in eternity. For the layman in these matters, the identity of a non-temporal, eternal event with a unique historical occurrence is something that is extremely difficult to conceive. He must, however, accustom himself to the idea that time is a relative concept and needs to be complemented by that of the simultaneous existence, in the bardo or pleroma of all historical processes. What exists in the pleroma as an eternal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence. That is to say, it is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. To take but one example, Yahweh had one good son and one who was a failure. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, correspond to this prototype. And so in all ages and in all parts of the world does the motif of the hostile brothers, which in innumerable modern variants still causes dissension in families and keeps the psychotherapist busy. Just as many examples, no less instructive, could be found for the two women prefigured in eternity. When these things occur as modern variants, therefore, they should not be regarded merely as personal episodes or moods or chance idiosyncrasies in public, but as fragments of the pleromic process itself, which, broken up into individual events occurring in time, is an essential component or aspect of the divine drama. Paragraph 630. When Yahweh created the world from his prima materia, the void, he could not help breathing his own mystery into the creation which is himself in every part, as every reasonable theology has long been convinced. From this comes the belief that it is possible to know God from his creation. When I say that he could not help doing this, I do not imply any limitation on his omnipotence. On the contrary, it is an acknowledgement that all possibilities are contained in him, and that there are, in consequence, no other possibilities than those which express him. Paragraph 631. This is actually the second time I've recorded this paragraph. Sometimes the ideas that Dr. Jung brought forward were so complex and sometimes so different from what I've learned in church, what others have learned in church, that I just find them a bit overwhelming. And indeed, the first time I read this paragraph, I literally fell asleep while I was reading it because my psyche was a bit overwhelmed by all of the ideas that are here. And I needed a little sleep in order to allow them to integrate. So this is my second try for paragraph 631. So if you find Dr. Jung's work overwhelming, I can assure you that for most of us it is. But nonetheless, it's very powerful and very important for humanity to understand these concepts for the future, in my opinion, which is why I'm doing this reading and why I operate the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. Paragraph 631. All the world is God's, and God is in all the world from the very beginning. Why then the tour de force of the Incarnation, one asks oneself, astonished. God is everything already. And yet there must be something missing if a sort of second entrance into creation has now to be staged with so much care and circumspection. Since creation is universal, reaching to the remotest stellar galaxies, and since it has also made organic life infinitely variable and capable of endless differentiation, we can hardly see where the defect lies. The fact that Satan has everywhere intruded his corrupting influence is no doubt regrettable for many reasons, but it makes no difference in principle. It is not easy to give an answer to this question. One would like to say that Christ had to appear in order to deliver mankind from evil. But when one considers that evil was originally slipped into the scheme of things by Satan, and still is, then it would seem much simpler if Yahweh would, for once, call this practical joker severely to account, get rid of his pernicious influence, and thus eliminate the root of all evil. he would then not need the elaborate arrangement of a special incarnation with all the unforeseeable consequences which this entails. One should make clear to oneself what it means when God becomes man. It means nothing less than a world-shaking transformation of God. It means more or less what creation meant in the beginning, namely an objectivation of God. At the time of the creation, he revealed himself in nature. Now he wants to be more specific and become man. It must be admitted, however, that there is a tendency in this direction right from the start. For when those other human beings, who had evidently been created before Adam, appeared on the scene along with the higher mammals, Yahweh created on the following day, by a special act of creation, a man who was the image of God. This was the first prefiguration of his becoming man. He took Adam's descendants, especially the people of Israel, into his personal possession, and from time to time he filled this people's prophets with his spirit. All these things were preparatory events and symptoms of a tendency within God to become man. But in omniscience, there had existed from all eternity a knowledge of the human nature of God, or of the divine nature of man. That is why, long before Genesis was written, we find corresponding testimonies in the ancient Egyptian records. These intimations and prefigurations of the Incarnation must strike one as either completely incomprehensible or superfluous. These intimations and prefigurations of the Incarnation must strike one as either completely incomprehensible or superfluous, since all creation ex nihilo is God's and consists of nothing but God, with the result that man, like the rest of creation, is simply God become concrete. Prefigurations, however, are not in themselves creative events, but are only stages in the process of becoming conscious. It was only quite late that we realized, or rather are beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore, last but not least, man. This realization is a millennial process. So I think you see what I mean. Paragraphs 632 to 634. 632. In view of the immense problem which we are about to discuss, this excursus on pleromatic events is not out of place as an introduction. Paragraph 633. What then is the real reason for the Incarnation as an historical event? Paragraph 634. In order to answer this question, we have to go rather far back. As we have seen, Yahweh evidently has a disinclination to take his absolute knowledge into account as a counterbalance to the dynamism of omnipotence. The most instructive example of this is his relation to Satan. It always looks as if Yahweh were completely uninformed about his son's intentions. That is because he never consults his omniscience. We can only explain this on the assumption that Yahweh was so fascinated by his successive acts of creation, so taken up with them, that he forgot about his omniscience altogether. It is quite understandable that the magical bodying forth of the most diverse objects, which had never before existed in such pristine splendor, should have caused God infinite delight. Sophia's memory is not at fault when she says, "When he marked out the foundation of the earth, then I was by him, like a master workman, and I was daily his delight." Proverbs 8:29-30. Paragraph 635. The book of Job still rings with the proud joy of creating when Yahweh points to the huge animals he has successfully turned out. "Behold, behemoth, which I made as I made you." He is first of the works of God, made to be Lord over his companions. Job 40, 15, and 19. Paragraphs 636 and 637. So even in Job's day, Yahweh is still intoxicated with the tremendous power and grandeur of his creation. Compared with this, what are Satan's pinpricks and the lamentations of human beings who were created with the behemoth, even if they bear God's image? Yahweh seems to have forgotten this fact entirely. Otherwise, he would never have ridden so roughshod over Job's human dignity. Paragraph 637. It is only the careful and far-sighted preparations for Christ's birth which show us that omniscience has begun to have a noticeable effect on Yahweh's actions. A certain philanthropic and universalistic tendency makes itself felt. The children of Israel take something of a second place in comparison with the children of men. After Job, we hear nothing further about new covenants. Proverbs and gnomic utterances seem to be the order of the day, and a real novum now appears on the scene, namely apocalyptic communications. This points to metaphysical acts of cognition, that is, to constellated unconscious contents which are ready to erupt into consciousness. In all this, as we have said, we discern the helpful hand of Sophia. Paragraph 638. To consider Yahweh's behavior up to the reappearance of Sophia as a whole, one indubitable fact strikes us. The fact that his actions are accompanied by an inferior consciousness. Paragraph 638. To consider Yahweh's behavior up to the reappearance of Sophia as a whole, one indubitable fact strikes us. The fact that his actions are accompanied by an inferior consciousness. Time and again we miss reflection and regard for absolute knowledge. His consciousness seems to be not much more than a primitive awareness which knows no reflection and no morality. One merely perceives and acts blindly, without conscious inclusion of the subject, whose individual existence raises no problems. Today we would call such a state psychologically unconscious, and in the eyes of the law it would be described as non compos mentis. The fact that consciousness does not perform acts of thinking does not, however, prove that they do not exist. They merely occur unconsciously and make themselves felt indirectly in dreams, visions, revelations, and instinctive changes of consciousness, whose very nature tells us that they derive from an unconscious knowledge and are the result of unconscious acts of judgment or unconscious conclusions. Paragraph 639. Some such process can be observed in the curious change which comes over Yahweh's behavior after the Job episode. There can be no doubt that he did not immediately become conscious of the moral defeat he had suffered at Job's hands. In his omniscience, of course, this fact had been known from all eternity, and it is not unthinkable that the knowledge of it unconsciously brought him into the position of dealing so harshly with Job, in order that he himself should become conscious of something through this conflict, and thus gain new insight. Satan, who, with good reason, later on received the name of Lucifer, knew how to make more frequent and better use of omniscience than did his father. It seems he was the only one among the sons of God who developed that much initiative. At all events, it was he who placed those unforeseen incidents in Yahweh's way, which omniscience knew to be necessary and indeed indispensable for the unfolding and completion of the divine drama. Among these, the case of Job was decisive, and it could only have happened thanks to Satan's initiative. Now, there is a footnote to this paragraph regarding the reference to Lucifer. In Christian tradition, too, there is a belief that God's intention to become man was known to the devil many centuries before, and this is why he instilled the Dionysus myth into the Greeks, so that they could say, when the joyful tidings reached them in reality, "So what? We knew all that long ago." When the conquistadors later discovered the crosses of the Mayas in Yucatan, the Spanish bishops used the same argument. Paragraph 640. The victory of the vanquished and oppressed is obvious. Job stands morally higher than Yahweh. In this respect, the creature has surpassed the Creator. As always, when an external event touches on some unconscious knowledge, this knowledge can reach consciousness. The event is recognized as a déjà vu, and one remembers a pre-existent knowledge about it. Something of the kind must have happened to Yahweh. Job's superiority cannot be shrugged off. Hence, a situation arises in which real reflection is needed. That is why Sophia steps in. She reinforces the much-needed self-reflection and thus makes possible Yahweh's decision to become man. It is a decision fraught with consequences. He raises himself above his earlier primitive level of consciousness by indirectly acknowledging that the man Job is morally superior to him, and that therefore he has to catch up and become human himself. Had he not taken this decision, he would have found himself in flagrant opposition to his omniscience. Yahweh must become man precisely because he has done man a wrong. He, the guardian of justice, knows that every wrong must be expiated, and wisdom knows that moral law is above even him. Because his creature has surpassed him, he must regenerate himself. Paragraph 641. As nothing can happen without a pre-existing pattern, not even creation ex nihilo, which must always resort to the treasure house of eternal images in the fabulous mind of the master workman, the choice of a model for the son who is now about to be begotten lies between Adam, to a limited extent, and Abel, to a much greater extent. Adam's limitation lies in the fact that even if he is the anthropos, he is chiefly a creature and a father. Abel's advantage is that he is the son well-pleasing to God, begotten and not directly created. One disadvantage has to be accepted. He met with an early death by violence, too early to leave behind him a widow and children, which ought really to be part of human fate if lived to the full. Abel is not the authentic archetype of the son well-pleasing to God. He is a copy, but the first of the kind to be met within the scriptures. The young dying God is also well known in the contemporary pagan religions, and so is the fratricide motif. We shall hardly be wrong in assuming that Abel's fate refers back to a metaphysical event which was played out between Satan and another son of God with a light nature and more devotion to his father. Egyptian tradition can give us information on this point. Horus and Seth. As we have said, the disadvantage prefigured in the Abel type can hardly be avoided because it is an integral part of the mythical son drama, as the numerous pagan variants of this motif show. The short, dramatic course of Abel's fate serves as an excellent paradigm for the life and death of a God become man. Paragraph 642. To sum up, the immediate cause of the Incarnation lies in Job's elevation, and its purpose is the differentiation of Yahweh's consciousness. For this, a situation of extreme gravity was needed, a peripeteia charged with effect, without which no higher level of consciousness can be reached. Paragraph 643. In addition to Abel, we have to consider, as a model for the impending birth of the Son of God, the general pattern of the hero's life, which has been established since time immemorial and handed down by tradition. Since this Son is not intended merely as a national Messiah, but as the universal Savior of mankind, we have also to consider the pagan myths and revelations concerning the life of one who is singled out by the gods. Paragraph 644. The birth of Christ is therefore characterized by all the usual phenomena attendant upon the birth of a hero, such as the Annunciation, the divine generation from a virgin, the coincidence of the birth with the thrice repeated conjunctio maxima in the sign of Pisces, which at that precise moment inaugurated the new era, the recognition of the birth of a king, the persecution of the newborn, his flight and concealment, his lowly birth, etc. The motif of the growing up of the hero is discernible in the wisdom of the 12-year-old child in the temple, and there are several examples in the Gospels of the breaking away from the mother. Paragraph 645. It goes without saying that a quite special interest attaches to the character and fate of the incarnate Son of God. Seen from a distance of nearly 2,000 years, it is uncommonly difficult to reconstruct a biographical picture of Christ from the traditions that have been preserved. Not a single text is extant which would fulfill even the minimum modern requirements for writing a history. The historically verifiable facts are extremely scanty, and the little biographically valid material that exists is not sufficient for us to create out of it a consistent career or an even remotely probable character. Certain theologians have discovered the main reason for this in the fact that Christ's biography and psychology cannot be separated from eschatology. Eschatology means in effect that Christ is God and man at the same time, and that he therefore suffers a divine as well as a human fate. The two natures interpenetrate so thoroughly that any attempt to separate them mutilates both. The divine overshadows the human, and the human being is scarcely graspable as an empirical personality. Even the critical procedures of modern psychology do not suffice to throw light on all the obscurities. Every attempt to single out one particular feature for clarity's sake does violence to another which is just as essential, either respect to his divinity or with respect to his humanity. The commonplace is so interwoven with the miraculous and the mythical that we can never be sure of our facts. Perhaps the most disturbing and confusing thing of all is that the oldest writings, those of St. Paul, do not seem to have the slightest interest in Christ's existence as a concrete human being. The synoptic Gospels are equally unsatisfactory, as they have more the character of propaganda than of biography. Paragraph 646. With regard to the human side of Christ, if we can speak of a purely human aspect at all, what stands out particularly clearly is his love of mankind. This feature is already implied in the relationship of Mary to Sophia, and especially in his genesis by the Holy Ghost, whose feminine nature is personified by Sophia, since she is the preliminary historical form who is symbolized by the dove, the bird belonging to the love goddess. Furthermore, the love goddess is in most cases the mother of the young dying God. Christ's love of mankind is, however, limited to a not inconsiderable degree by a certain predestinarian tendency, which sometimes causes him to withhold his salutary message from those who do not belong to the elect. If one takes the doctrine of predestination literally, it is difficult to see how it can be fitted into the framework of the Christian message. But taken psychologically, as a means to achieving a definite effect, it can readily be understood that these allusions to predestination give one a feeling of distinction. If one knows that one has been singled out by divine choice and intention from the beginning of the world, then one feels lifted beyond the transitoriness and meaninglessness of ordinary human existence and transported to a new state of dignity and importance, like one who has a part in the divine world drama. In this way, man is brought nearer to God, and this is in entire accord with the meaning of the message in the Gospels. Paragraph 647. Besides his love of mankind, a certain irascibility is noticeable in Christ's character, and, as is often the case with people of emotional temperament, a manifest lack of self-reflection. There is no evidence that Christ ever wondered about himself or that he ever confronted himself. To this rule, there is only one significant exception: the despairing cry from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Here, his human nature attains divinity. At that moment, God experiences what it means to be a mortal man and drinks to the dregs what he made his faithful servant Job suffer. Here is given the answer to Job, and clearly, this supreme moment is as divine as it is human, as eschatological as it is psychological. And at this moment, too, where one can feel the human being so absolutely, the divine myth is present in full force. And both mean one and the same thing. How then can one possibly demythologize the figure of Christ? A rationalistic attempt of that sort would soak all the mystery out of his personality, and what remained would no longer be the birth and tragic fate of a god in time, but, historically speaking, a badly authenticated religious teacher, a Jewish reformer who was Hellenistically interpreted and misunderstood, a kind of Pythagoras maybe, or, if you like, a Buddha or a Mohammed, but certainly not a son of God or a God incarnate. Nor does anybody seem to have realized what would be the consequences of a Christ disinfected of all trace of eschatology. Today we have an empirical psychology which continues to exist despite the fact that the theologians have done their best to ignore it, and with its help, we can put certain of Christ's statements under the microscope. If these statements are detached from their mythical context, they can only be explained personalistically. But what sort of conclusions are we bound to arrive at if a statement like, "I am the way and the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me," is reduced to personal psychology? Obviously, the same conclusion as that reached by Jesus' relatives when, in their ignorance of eschatology, they said, "He is beside himself." What is the use of a religion without a mythos? Since religion means, if anything at all, precisely that function which links us back to the eternal myth. There's a footnote, John 14:6, paragraph 648. In view of these portentous impossibilities, it has been assumed, perhaps as the result of a growing impatience with the difficult factual material, that Christ was nothing but a myth, in this case no more than a fiction. But myth is not fiction. It consists of facts that are continually repeated and can be observed over and over again. It is something that happens to man, and men have mythical fates just as much as the Greek heroes do. The fact that the life of Christ is largely myth does absolutely nothing to disprove its factual truth. Quite the contrary. I would even go so far as to say that the mythical character of a life is just what expresses its universal human validity. It is perfectly possible, psychologically, for the unconscious or an archetype to take complete possession of a man and to determine his fate down to the smallest detail. At the same time, objective, non-psychic parallel phenomena can occur which also represent the archetype. It not only seems so, it simply is so, that the archetype fulfills itself not only psychically in the individual, but objectively outside the individual. My own conjecture is that Christ was such a personality. The life of Christ is just what it had to be if it is the life of a God and a man at the same time. It is a symbolism, a bringing together of heterogeneous natures, rather as if Job and Yahweh were combined in a single personality. Yahweh's intention to become man, which resulted from his collision with Job, is fulfilled in Christ's life and suffering.